As I said, we were in Hebrews 11 on Sunday, and I know, went specifically through verse 16, but we talked a little bit about the second example of Abraham that's given, that verse 17 talks about, that by faith, when he was tested, Abraham offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promise was in fact offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And so that word, only begotten, I think is how the King James Version translates that particular word with regard to Isaac, when it talks about his only son. It's a specific word that it does not indicate what we would typically think of when we would say, yeah, he only had one son. It was his only son. Instead, it has reference to, as the passage goes on to talk about, the promised one. And so that same idea of only begotten is, of course, used of Jesus. But the reality is, does God have only one son? He has many sons. In fact, everyone that was created in his image is his sons and daughters. So he has many, but only begotten is used of Jesus because he is the son of promise. And the reality is, he was the son of promise just as Isaac was the son of promise in some ways, because the promises were made through Abraham. Jesus, of course, was promised long before Abraham was even alive. And the idea of Jesus coming as the sacrifice for sin was in the mind of God before even there was a world that existed and time was here. So when it says only begotten or only son of, speaking of Isaac, it's a reference specifically to him being the son of promise, that through him all of his offspring should be named. And that the fulfillment of those three promises that Abraham was given were specifically going to come through Isaac. And so Isaac was a special child. He was the son of promise that God had promised to him. And as a result of that, when Abraham took him up to offer him, it wasn't just as though he was offering one of his children, one of his sons. It was that he was offering the one that God promised to bring all of those promises to fulfillment through. And so, because God had specifically named that through Isaac your seed shall be named and all these promises should be fulfilled, it's not as though if Abraham offered Isaac willingly to God, that God could then just say, well, we'll use Ishmael instead, because Isaac's now dead, because God had specifically named Isaac as being the promised son. And so Abraham, we're told in this text, and we talked about this a little bit on Sunday, believed what? The Hebrew writer is really the only one who, by inspiration of the Holy Spirit, gives us insight into this particular fact that is left out of Genesis 22. Okay, he believed that God was able even to raise him from the dead. And the real point behind that is that while God was calling on Abraham to offer Isaac, who is the son of promise, Abraham did that with faith in God because he knew that God is faithful and that God was going to keep that promise. He didn't know how he was going to keep the promise, and that's kind of the point of the Hebrew writer. It's not that he's saying, well, God was going to let me kill him and then he was going to bring him back to life. It just says that even if that were the steps that were necessary, the point is he recognized God is faithful and God was going to keep his promise, one way or the other. I may not see how that's going to all come to fulfillment, but I know what God's promised, and God always keeps his promises. So he's going to work out the details, but he'll take care of it. And that's kind of perhaps what was meant by him when he said to Isaac on the mountain, the Lord will provide. Remember, they left their servants and went on up on the mountain, he and Isaac alone. And Isaac looked at him and said, see, here's the wood for the burnt offering and the fire, but where's the sacrifice? And Abraham's statement to Isaac was, God will provide. And of course he did. And Abraham didn't at the time understand the fullness to which God would provide, right? Because that's what we're reading about really in Hebrews, which perhaps is the reason why the Hebrew writer calls attention to this specific example and why the words are used in the way that they're used in this particular account. Because even though Isaac was the son of promise somewhat in the immediate circumstances that were going on, who is the real son of promise? Jesus is. And so the interesting thing is, although that phrase is not specifically used here with regard to Isaac, Isaac then, in the words of Hebrews, would be a what with regard to Jesus? A foreshadowing, a type or antitype. The type, and Jesus is the antitype. He would be a copy or a shadow of Jesus. And so there are lots of words that are used here in this particular account that ultimately are a foreshadowing of the ultimate Son of promise, who was to also come through whom? The one we're reading about in Hebrews 11, Abraham. Which by extension means he came through Isaac too, right? But the promise was to Abraham. I mean, yeah, we know he passed it on to Isaac and to Jacob and then to David. But in the Jews' mind, the promise began with Abraham. And so Jesus is the only begotten. He is the son of promise. And though God did not permit Abraham to follow through and kill Isaac, God himself was responsible for, by his foreknowledge and foreordination, what happened to Jesus. He was offered up as a sacrifice, and God did then what? Raise him from the dead. So, again, I think all of this language in the words of Hebrews, or in the mind of the Holy Spirit who's inspiring the Hebrew writer to write these things, is very much designed to kind of pull all of this together, and again reiterates to us, Isaac was obviously special to Abraham, but who's greater? Jesus is. So he was greater than the angels back in chapter 1, greater than Moses. He is greater than all the high priests and priests of old, and he's also greater than Isaac. And I mean, there's some sense in which, because he's greater than Melchizedek even, who was deemed to be greater than Abraham, he's greater than Abraham too. So we've looked at all these greater thans, and I think the language that's used here in this text is designed to kind of bring all of that to our mind. By faith, Isaac, verse 20 says, invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. By faith, when Jacob was dying, or Jacob when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. And then we come to Joseph. And I mean, I don't mean to skip Isaac and Jacob. It's obvious from the Hebrew writer's words that they were faithful individuals. But when it comes to the Genesis account, we've got a lot written about Abraham, right? What about Isaac and Jacob? There's quite a bit that's written about Jacob, but what's the primary focus? Finding his wife, but even more than that, beyond that, once he gets his wives, his children, I mean, and ultimately him being renamed as Israel. And so it's the focus on Jacob is really on the children that he's bearing and on the nation that he is ultimately fathering. A very small amount really is written about Isaac at all. And then we come to the real point of the latter half of the book of Genesis, which is whom? Joseph. I am fascinated, though, by the fact that of all the things that the Hebrew writer could have brought to attention from the life of Joseph. I mean, you think about it. Now, I know we're reading Hebrews 11, so it's on our minds because it's specifically stated. But if you were to think about the life of Joseph and the faithfulness of Joseph, what would be the first thing that would come to your mind? Please don't say the one that's here in Hebrews, because I don't think that's true. It's an aside that's barely mentioned at the end of Genesis chapter 50. And I think unless we were reading it here, I don't think any of us would use this as the example of the faithfulness of Joseph. Okay. He weathered the unfair imprisonment. He weathered or he was faithful through the schemes that his brothers plotted against him. He was faithful in the face of Potiphar's wife. He was faithful even when the baker and the butler forgot him. He was faithful. I mean, you could name any of those things as examples of Joseph's faithfulness. But the Hebrew writer by inspiration chooses what? Like I said, it's barely something that's mentioned at the very end of Genesis 50, right before we go to the life of Moses. Yeah. Joseph made the Israelites promise before he died. When I die, I want you to have me embalmed here in Egypt. And when the children of Israel do what? When they return to the land of Canaan, I want them to take my bones with them and bury them there in that place. Now, I want you to think about, in the grand scheme of things, why that is such an important example of faithfulness. And I mean, we can talk about it a little bit in the context of Hebrews as well, especially verses 13 through 16. But I want you to think about it in the grand scheme of things. I mean, obviously, there were a number of different things that Joseph did that represented his faithfulness to God that are important, and I'm not making light of those. But what was going to happen for the next few generations in Egypt? I mean, Israel right now, when Joseph's alive, what kind of status do they enjoy in Egypt? Yeah, I mean, compared to, for a small family, they're faring pretty well. And because of Joseph, Pharaoh and the people of Egypt are treating them with a great deal of respect and consideration, right? But what's going to happen after the Pharaoh of Joseph dies and Joseph's dead? There's going to be another Pharaoh that's going to arise, and he's going to have a different plan with regard to Israel. What's his big plans for Israel? Yeah, we're just going to make them a bunch of slaves. So for a few generations now, they're going to be enslaved in Egypt, which, if we go all the way back to Abraham, this was promised back when God made the promises to Abraham. So it's not something that's unexpected, although I'm guessing for most of Israel it was, because those are not the highlights of the story that you want to focus on, are they? I mean, God made all these great promises to Abraham, so what we're looking forward to is we're going to go back to Canaan, and we're going to be in a land that's flowing with milk and honey. We're going to prosper. That's what's going to happen to us. Well, we skipped over the whole part about the fact that we're going to be slaves in a foreign land, and so these few generations are going to go past, and they're going to be enslaved. What does having Joseph's bones and the instructions that he gave provide for them, or what should it provide for them? Hope. Did you have something, Joy? Is that? Yeah, I mean, what does he say? What does it say?
Saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones with you from here. So he reminded them and made them swear to knowing God would deliver them despite their being enslaved.
And that's the beautiful thing. I mean, okay, Joseph was faithful in a lot of other instances. But contrary to what we read back in 13 through 16, what ultimately did Joseph experience because of his faithfulness in those other areas? So he's imprisoned after Potiphar's wife, but then what happens eventually? Yeah, it's a little while, but he becomes entrusted with a lot of responsibility, not only for a household now, but for an entire nation, and ultimately for nations, because all the nations are going to come to Egypt because of the fact that God gives Joseph information that nobody else has and allows him to preserve the food in Egypt, which then becomes a storehouse for other nations to come to in the midst of this famine too. So Joseph arises to a pretty powerful position. So we could look at it and say, well, I mean, Joseph enjoys quite a bit of prominence in the latter part of the book of Genesis because of his faithfulness. What about with regard to this example of faithfulness that's used with regard to Joseph? What did he see of it in the flesh? Because I have no idea what he saw beyond that. What did he see of this promise in the flesh? It's okay, you can say it. Yeah, he's dead. I mean, what does it really matter what happens to his bones? He's not going to see Canaan. He's not going to be with Israel to go up. And so what's key in this example is this is nothing about him. This is left, yes, it's an example of his faith and faithfulness, but it is left for the children of Israel as a source of hope and a testimony to the faithfulness of God in keeping his promises. And when you think back on the life of Joseph, had Joseph's life always been rosy? Was Joseph a man who knew heartache and trial and difficulty? And so for him to hold to this fact that God is faithful was a strong testimony and a strong witness to the faithfulness of God, and thus becomes a strong testimony to the faith of Joseph. And so this was about preserving for Israel something that could provide them with hope in the midst of all their struggle. And I can only read about what happened to Israel and imagine how difficult that must have been and how hard it must have been to keep the hope. But it's not a huge stretch of the imagination for me, because there are times in our own lives where we struggle to keep hope too, in the sense of seeing how we're going to make it through the trials that we're facing and trying to see beyond what's going on now to the promises that God has provided for us in the future. And some of those promises now, but some of them beyond now, to a time that we look forward to experiencing beyond this life. And so Joseph's example, even though it's not the first one we would think of, is a really strong example when you really reflect on all that's involved with it. Okay, anything else about from Abel to Joseph? We're going to move to the law now with Moses. So Moses is actually the next one that's mentioned, but whose example of faith is actually being talked about in verse 23. Yeah. And in some sense, his parents, both at least in the English Standard Version, are included here. And I do think it's important because the word that's used is because they saw that the child was what? Okay, is that what the English or the New Americans? Yeah, that's really a better translation, because the reality is most parents think what about their children? Even though it's not true. We know it's not true. What do most parents think about their children? They're all beautiful. Even though it's not true. That's what most parents think. Right? Every time I think about that, though, it reminds me of a story my grandmother told about my great aunt when she saw her firstborn son. Anyway, so I'm not telling that story right now. This is not the place for that story, but I can't help but think of it. So, because they saw the child was beautiful, that's not the real point, at least not in the typical sense of the way that we use the word beautiful in English, with the idea of pleasing to the eye or pretty or whatever. But the idea of what Chuck was saying, in whichever translation it was that he was mentioning, is the concept of special. They saw that there was something special about this child. Now, I'm going to ask the $64 million question. What was it? Because, okay, let's be honest. When Moses was born, do you think they looked at him and said, oh boy, this is the child that's going to deliver Israel? You think either one of them saw that? I don't think so. I mean, I'm just... So what was it that they saw about him that was so special? You know, my answer is, I have no idea. I don't know. Yes? Right. Yeah, I don't know if God visited them or if the steps that they took led to him surviving, and that's what they saw was special in him. But there was something about Moses that they saw was special, and so they were really careful about all that they did to try to help preserve his life, and it was successful. Yep. And I mean, seemingly, if I'm not mistaken, I know there was a period of time when his wife ultimately circumcised his sons, but I don't see any reason to doubt that Moses was circumcised on the 8th day the way that the other Jewish boys were supposed to be. And so it would have been fairly evident that this was a Hebrew child. I know Pharaoh's daughter recognized that. If that information got back to Pharaoh or not, I don't know. But the fact is he was preserved. And his parents are mentioned here for hiding him for 3 months because they saw something special in him. It's mentioned as it being a representative of their faith. Then we have Moses. What did Moses do by faith? And there's a few things. He refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to do what? Okay, to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. This is a favorite passage for people to grab a hold of. I mean, I think the point that's made from this passage is a valid one, right? What is true about sin? Two things in this text that I think it's important for us to acknowledge. The first one, instead of denying it, because I think that's what we do a lot of times as parents, is that we deny this truth with regard to sin. And it's a fact.
A pleasure.
Sin provides pleasure.
But it's passing.
That's the second truth that's listed here. But I, like I said, I want to be clear about the first one because I think it's important. I think sometimes we make it sound like sin is just bad. And it is. Sin is horrible. And if you need proof of it, look at the cross. God was willing to go to that length in order to deal with sin. Sin is serious. And I mean, even when you think about it from the perspective of physical consequences and experiences in this life, how does sin turn out now? It turns out badly. But initially, what is true? There is pleasure in it. The reality is, if there wasn't, would there be much temptation? If everything about sin was painful, wouldn't that be so much easier? Right? I mean, we avoid dieting and exercise and all that stuff because it's painful. If sin was painful, it'd just be easy. We could just, we don't have to worry about that. That's not tempting to me at all. I don't like pain. I don't want that. But it's not. There's a lot about sin that isn't pleasurable. But the second truth that's found here in this text is that those pleasures are passing. Now, with regard to the passing nature of those pleasures, pleasure or passing sounds like kind of what? We might use another word that's fleeting. What kind of length or duration does that sound like typically? Sounds like a pretty quick, like it's the pleasures are quickly gone. There are some sins that are like that, right? You basically no more than finish committing the sin until the pleasure's gone. But the reality is that there are some that the pleasure seems to last for a longer period of time. But ultimately, what is true of every sin and its pleasure? It is fleeting. It is, to use another word that's similar to the idea or concept of fleeting in Ecclesiastes, it is vanity and like grasping for the wind. Trying to fulfill your life by the pleasures that sin provides is what? I know which phrase I've got, but you can come up with others. I mean, think about it. Does the drug addict get relief from his drugs? Well, we say yes and no. And the reality is we're both right? Somebody said it. Temporarily, yes. But what happens when the drug wears off? You got to do it again in order to get the same relief. You do, and ultimately, sometimes what happens? You do too much of it, you do so much of it, because you've got to keep increasing the amount that you use until ultimately you do what? You overdose. But here's the other thing that drug addicts and people who are addicted to alcohol find out, is that while it temporarily relieves the problems that they have, and it makes them feel better, what is typically true once they become sober and are no longer under the influence of the drug or the alcohol?
Guilt.
Huh?
Guilt. And
Not only guilt is true, and sometimes the guilt hits immediately. But what is true of the problems that existed before they even started the drugs? They're never resolved. They're still there. And furthermore, in most of those cases, what happens? That problem may not be worse, but now you've got a whole lot more problems on top of it. And so, the addiction to drugs and alcohol is a classic example of the passing nature of the pleasure of sin, and the fact that it ultimately doesn't fulfill in the way that we want it to. Now, on the other hand, what does God offer to us? Joy's got something.
Rest and peace.
Rest and peace. Joy's got something. Yeah, he promises us him. He promises the rest and peace, as Chuck said, and he promises not to give us more than we can bear. Does God promise to immediately take away all the pain? No. But will God ultimately provide true relief? Drugs and alcohol can't. They just magnify the problem and multiply it. But God can. Now, may it take time. And in fact, the reality is, may it take time is probably unnecessary. It will always take time. The question becomes, how much time will it take to get the relief that we're seeking after? But when we get relief, it will be a true relief, and it will be a more lasting relief. And that doesn't mean that the pain may not continue to come back over time, but it does generally mean, at least in my experience and the experience of a lot of other people that I know, it generally diminishes and grows smaller, and the problem is improved. And certainly we find the support that we truly need to endure it and to bear up under it and to grow stronger through it, that alcohol and drugs and those kinds of things can't provide. And there are other things people are addicted to. Some people are addicted to sex. Some people are addicted to extreme sports because of the adrenaline rush that they get. Some of those extreme sports is not necessarily a sinful thing, but again, what do most of those athletes find, if you know anything about them? And if they're using it not as just a source of recreation and enjoyment, but using it as a way to cope with problems.
Find that satisfaction.
You still don't solve the problem. You're still not resolving the real issue that exists behind. The adrenaline rush of jumping off the cliff and skirting the mountain in your little squirrel suit before you pull your chute may be exciting and fun, and it may take away momentarily take away the thoughts of what it is that you're facing. But when you finally get down to the bottom of the mountain and the adrenaline rush crashes and you get over the sleep, you wake up and the problems that were there before that you were trying to escape are still there. And the only true source of solving that problem, solving the issues that we have in life, is through Christ. I mean, that's the bottom line. Yes, ma'am.
I mean, there's even addictions that aren't inherently dangerous at all, like shopping and eating and, doing little things like that. And you realize that you're trying to just fill a hole that no matter how much you eat, no matter how much you spend, no matter what cool new technology you buy, nothing's going to fill that hole.
Come on, the new toy's not going to fix it. I think it was Augustine that said there's a God-shaped hole in everyone. And so, I mean, essentially there is a hole in every one of us, in our soul, in our spirit, and the only one who can really fill that is God. And we can try all kinds of other things, and we may find some temporary relief and some temporary enjoyment, but those pleasures and that relief is passing. And Moses recognized that and was willing to be counted with the children of Israel instead. Yes, ma'am.
I was just thinking about AA in general is that it is a support group, which, is a good message for us. The other thing is that many end up seeking God to deal with it if there's any benefit to that. I mean, that to me would be the benefit, that they're up against a wall and they start looking at God.
Sure. And I mean, the support group does do a significant amount to helping to overcome the addiction, which is the primary focus. But I mean, again, there are issues that exist in our lives that ultimately only God can help us through in the way that we need to find true satisfaction. And that's kind of a point that I've made a lot before, is that Christians, people of God, have the greatest opportunity for truly finding fulfillment in this life. Of course, the only people to find fulfillment in the life to come. But as far as the fullness of what God intended this life to be, ultimately it is His people who can find that. And they can find it in the midst of some horrific circumstances because of the hope and the peace that He provides. Yes, sir. Andrew.
I think there's a theme in all of the examples given so far in Hebrews 11. I think all the ones we will read about. They've attained the ability to see the ultimate fulfillment of what they're hoping for outside of their current life. the pleasure that Moses would have experienced, the life that he would have led, the riches of all of Egypt, that probably would have lasted a lifetime for
Sure.
Moses. It probably would have never run out, and he probably could have died in his old age rich, as a son of Egypt. So the fleeting pleasures of sin may last your entire life,
Right.
and you may lead what looks to the world to be a great life, surrounded by people praising you and fame and the wealth, and it can be for your whole life. And you're memorialized in death, and people write, newspaper articles about you. But what all these people are realizing is that they by faith, they gain the ability to see that the fulfillment they're searching for may not even exist in this life. Real fulfillment may be in another life or another existence altogether.
Right.
And that's the thing that that I see common between all of them, that they're enlightened with. There was another comment, I'll just bring it up, because when you were talking about Moses' parents,
Yes.
and I'm cheating because my Bible had a note about this, but
Ah.
Stephen's sermon in Acts chapter 7 actually mentions them. And it says that in Acts chapter 7, at the time Moses was born, and he was beautiful in God's sight, and he was brought up for 3 months in his father's house. So, but I think, what did his parents see in him? I think they saw a potential for fulfillment of God's promise, potentially in a lifetime that wasn't even their own.
Right.
They had this child born, and they said to themselves, it may not even be in our lifetime, but this child feels like proof that God's promise could keep going if his people can continue. And so I think that's the hope that they saw when they said that their child was beautiful. I think that's what they were envisioning. And again, it's the same theme of you see that fulfillment, and it's in a lifetime that's not even your own. It's an existence that you may not even ever see yourself, but you have a hope for it.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we definitely see that from what Abraham and Isaac and Jacob saw with regard to their sojourning. And then with Joseph and the mention of his bones, the parents of Moses here. What else did Moses do by faith? He left Egypt. Which time do you think they're talking about? Because he left Egypt twice. He did. And this one specifically says what? What? And it specifically says not being afraid of the king of Egypt. So it means it's which time does it mean? Yeah, it means it was when he was guiding the children of Israel out, and connected with the Passover that's also mentioned by faith. He kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. So Moses is held up as an example of faith, not surprisingly. It's one of those that we would look at and we're like, duh. I mean, that's, of course, Moses is an example of faith. Then verse 29, who's next?
Israelites.
People that we don't really usually hold up as examples of faithfulness, but their faith in doing what is held up before us. And it is pretty amazing. I think sometimes we read through some of these accounts of things that happened, especially in the Old Testament, but even the New, some of the miracles of Jesus and miracles of the apostles. I think we read through them and we're like, well, yeah. So, and then we answer Bible class questions. So, what happened? Well, Moses raised his staff, and the Red Sea parted, and they walked through on dry ground. But when you stop and consider all of that, I mean, really think about it. I mean, if you were able to go out in the middle of a river or a sea, and you had the ability to part the water and spread it open so that people could walk through it, what would the ground be like? It would be a muddy mess, right? You're not walking across on dry ground. So God opens up the sea, dries the ground, and Israel walks through that. I want you to picture, because it's described in Exodus, what did that look like? I'm walking through on dry ground, and I look left, and what do I see? A wall of water. And I look right, and what do I see? And what's holding it up? From what you can see, what's holding it up? Nothing. How you feel about that? Let's get moving. I don't know how long this is going to last, but if it comes crashing down, we're not getting out of here. So a wall of water on the left and on the right. I mean, I think we just read through that and we think, yeah, God split the water and they walked through the Red Sea. Yeah, it was dry ground. But I mean, when you really think about the nature of what that was like, did that take a little faith? It took a whole lot of faith. I mean, I like water a lot. Don't get me wrong. I love the water. But I'm not loving that. I mean, walking through that with this wall of water on the left and the right, and nothing holding it up. Yes, I understand God was holding it up. But as far as you can see, there is nothing holding that up. It's just there. And I mean, in a moment, it could all be here. And I know that because once Israel got through, what happened? Egypt's like, psh. Yeah, they got, and that's, I mean, again, that's one of the details I think we just skip over. And then what happened? They get bogged down in the mud, and the Egyptians are having a struggle getting through the same land Israel just crossed on. And then what happens? Those walls God's been holding up, God lets go of, and it all comes crashing in, and they all drown. So I mean, it is a remarkable thing. By the way, there's a story about a little boy who was celebrating after Bible class, celebrating that he had read about all of this, and he was excited about it. And this man stopped and asked him, "What are you so excited about?" And he told him that God parted the Red Sea, and Israel marched through on dry ground, and then all the Egyptians were drowned. And the guy said, "Yeah, young man, but what you should realize is that modern science has proved that the area where Israel went through was only about 18 inches deep." The boy stood there for a minute and kind of puzzled and thought about it. And then he got excited again. The man said, "Did you not hear what I said? Why are you so excited now?" And he said, "It's even more of a miracle than I thought it was. God drowned the entire Egyptian army in 18 inches of water." I mean, it doesn't matter how you spin that story. It's incredible what God did on that occasion when he led Israel out of Egypt. Joy, you had something. You can have the last word tonight.
Okay, well, I was just going to say that when you started talking about the things that we've read many times and we skip over, I had to go back to verse 26. We're still talking about Moses many years before Christ, and it says he considered the reproach of Christ. How in the world can he consider the reproach of Christ? Wealth than the treasures of Egypt, where he was looking for the reward.